You know that drawer she wiped her hands on before reaching for the flour tin, the one nobody else was allowed to touch? You learned what was in it by watching, never by asking. The recipes were her hands. Here are 30 vintage British teatime treats that have completely disappeared. Rock buns with a taste of wartime ingenuity, pressed into rough, craggy mounds, dense with dried currants and mixed spice, bumped on top and not remotely apologetic about it. The Ministry of Food promoted them in government leaflets during the war years precisely because they demanded so little. Fewer eggs, less sugar, the oatmeal that bulked them when white flour ran short. You made them on a Sunday, oven already going for the bread, and they were done in 15 minutes. Church Fates sold them 3 for a penny. Kids ate them still warm, burning their fingers because waiting was not an option. They were not glamorous, and nobody pretended they were. The point was, they were there, on the tea table, when real cake was not possible. When sugar rationing ended in 1953, and the nation could finally bake properly again, rock buns quietly stepped aside. Nobody mourned them. Most people do now. The smell hit you before you reached the kitchen. Rich, savory, animal. Dripping toast was already under the grill. Beef dripping, rendered from the Sunday joint and poured hot into a white basin, set overnight in the larder into 2 distinct layers. Pale, creamy fat on top, dark jeweled meat jelly underneath. Both went on toast. The fat you spread thick, the jelly you scraped and let melt into the bread, then salted. That was all of it. Working-class families across the Midlands and the North ate dripping toast through the 40s and 50s, not from poverty, but from the satisfaction of wasting nothing. The dripping basin sat on every kitchen shelf, topped up weekly, never empty. When she stopped keeping it, when the joint came ready-wrapped from the supermarket, nobody made a ceremony of it. The basin went into the back of the cupboard one day and never came out. You can still spread dripping on toast. It will never taste the same. Seed cake held the centre of the Victorian and Edwardian teatime table with quiet authority. Plain, dry, close-crumbed, flavoured entirely with caraway seeds whose sharp aniseed scent filled the kitchen during baking and clung to the tin for days. It was the cake you made for visitors, not because it was impressive, but because it was correct. Mrs. Beeton included it. Every serious housewife had a version. In the North, they called the texture clack, the way it caught slightly on the roof of your mouth, and they understood this as a virtue. The caraway kept it from being cloying, which meant you could eat it slice after slice with tea. By the 1960s, it had lost ground to lighter, sweeter sponges, the very caraway that gave it character being the thing that made it impossible to sell to a generation raised on icing. If there was a seed cake in your family, someone made it. The memory of who made it and the recipe were often the same thing, and when one went, the other followed. Lardy cake was never delicate and never supposed to be. A yeasted dough folded around layers of pure lard, sugar, dried fruit and spice, baked until the bottom caramelized into a dark, sticky crust. Elizabeth David instructed you to turn it upside down after baking, so the fat soaked back through. She was right. The cake originated along the chalk belt from Wiltshire through Oxfordshire to Cambridgeshire and was harvest food, made for celebration days in farmhouse kitchens, where the oven fired only once a fortnight. Leftover bread dough became lardy cake, which is why it was also called a scrap cake. David was blunt about the requirement for real lard. Without it, they cannot be lardy cakes. The 1970s and the 1980s drained lard from British kitchens faster than almost any other ingredient. Lardy cake followed it out the door. What's left is expensive and artisan. Nothing like the thing pulled straight from a farmhouse oven into working hands on a harvest afternoon. Before a birthday cake was something you could afford, Northumberland pitmen's families made singin' hinnies, round griddle cakes of lard and butter, kneaded with flour and dried fruit, cooked on a flat bake stone until they hissed and spat. The sizzle gave them their name. Hinny was Northumberland dialect for honey, a term of endearment, and the singing was the fat hitting hot iron. 19th century records describe them as essential at colliery tables, since pit work demanded calorific food and singing hinnies delivered it. A German travel writer observed that no proper pitman's holiday table was ever without them, hissing hot. For families who couldn't afford a real birthday cake, they served as the substitute tuppenny and threepenny pieces hidden inside the dough before it hit the bake stone. You split them warm and pressed in butter that melted instantly. Equal parts lard and butter was the standard. Anything less, and the hinny sang quietly, not loud. The bake stone is gone from almost every kitchen now. Bara brith, speckled bread, started the night before in every Welsh farmhouse that made it seriously. Dried fruit and sugar were covered in strong black tea and left to soak overnight, the fruit swelling until almost jammy. In the morning you added flour, mixed spice and an egg, poured it into a loaf tin, and baked it low and slow. Originally a festive treat saved for Christmas and St. David's Day, it became a tea-time fixture across Wales. Sliced thick and generously buttered, the butter half melting into the warm crumb. Welsh settlers who left for Patagonia in 1865 took it with them. Their South American neighbours called it torta negra. Back in Wales, a survey in 2007 found that 36% of Welsh teenagers had never tasted it. The overnight soaking ritual had become something only the women who remembered it still did. The recipe survived those women. Not all of those women survived to see it come back into fashion. Welsh cakes were never baked. They were cooked on the bake stone, a flat iron griddle set directly over the heat, and that dry contact gave them a crust no oven could replicate. Bronzed on both surfaces, slightly gritty, the currents pressing through the dough. Miners' wives in the South Wales coalfields made them because they were fast and durable. They lasted 3 weeks without going off. You put them in the miner's pocket in the morning, they were still good at the end of the shift. The Welsh name is picaw ar maen, cakes on the stone, and the stone was the heart of every kitchen that produced them properly. You didn't measure. You poured flour until the bowl looked right, rubbed fat in by feel, held your palm above the bake stone to judge the heat. Nobody wrote that down because nobody needed to. You learned it by standing there. Now hardly anyone has a bake stone, and what the right temperature feels like under your hand went with the hands that knew it. Treacle tart was built from the two cheapest things in any British kitchen: golden syrup and stale breadcrumbs. As it baked, the crumbs swelled and set into a dense amber filling, sweet enough to make your back teeth ache, smelling of caramel and warm tin. Golden syrup only arrived in British kitchens in the 1880s, after Abram Lyle's refinery found a use for the thick byproduct of sugar processing, which is why treacle tart was always a late Victorian working-class treat, never an older one. Sharpened with lemon juice, held in short-crust pastry, served warm with custard that ran into the cracks. School kitchens through the 50s and 60s made it on Fridays, when the week's stale bread needed using up. The dinner ladies knew the filling was ready when it deepened 2 shades, and the pastry edges went biscuit brown. That knowledge didn't transfer by recipe card. It transferred by watching, and by doing, and by not being there to pass it on. They called it eggless, butterless, milkless cake in the Ministry of Food pamphlets, one of the blunter names in British culinary history, and entirely accurate. During the war years, when eggs were rationed to 1 per person per week and butter to 2 ounces, government leaflets instructed housewives how to bake without the ingredients baking normally required. The recipe was 3 sentences long. You boiled water with brown sugar, dried fruit, and whatever fat you had, let it cool, folded in flour and bicarbonate, and baked it in a greased tin. Dense, dark, faintly spiced, and genuinely good in the way things made under constraint often managed to be. The women who made it called it cake, because that is what it was. Cake made under difficult conditions by people who refused to accept scarcity as a reason to go without. The recipe traveled through dozens of Ministry of Food leaflets under different names: war cake, economy cake, simple fruit bake. What every version shared was a refusal, built into 3 plain sentences, to pretend going without was ever the right answer. Parkin must be made at least 3 days before you eat it. Not a suggestion, but a rule understood by everyone in Yorkshire or Lancashire who grew up with it. You bake it hard and flat, wrap it when it cools, and leave it. Over those days, the black treacle and oatmeal pull moisture through the crumb, turning the dense dry slab into something sticky surfaced and deeply spiced. By bonfire night, it should be ready. In Leeds, the 5th of November was known as Parkin Night as far back as 1862, when Parkin and treacle toffee were already established bonfire foods. Yorkshire Parkin uses black treacle and oatmeal, and Lancashire uses golden syrup. The argument about which county made it correctly could outlast marriages. You knew which version was right because you knew which grandmother made it. You assumed she would always be there to make it again. The tin in the larder, the waiting, the smell of the kitchen in early November. Until one year you realised no new tin was starting. Eccles cakes were sold from James Birch's shop in Lancashire as early as 1793. Small rounds of flaky pastry, slashed in a diamond pattern on top, packed with currants, candied peel and brown sugar, baked until the filling oozed and caramelised at the slashes. They descended from Saints' Day cakes, sweet pastry treats made for the rare public holidays of medieval Britain, when communities gathered to eat something better than bread. Properly eaten with Lancashire cheese, the sharpness cutting through the sticky sweetness in a combination that made no obvious sense until you tried it. Hers were always better than the shop's. She worked the filling by hand until the currants had almost dissolved into the sugar, the pastry thinner because she'd learned by watching, not by recipe, and she never measured the lard. She made 2 dozen for the church fete every July, gone within the hour. The fete still runs each summer. Nobody brings Eccles cakes anymore. Manchester tart had 3 layers, and all 3 mattered. Short crust pastry, blind baked to pale gold. A base of raspberry jam spread to the edges, then thick vanilla custard poured over and baked until just set, finished with a snowfall of desiccated coconut. Always the dry packaged kind. The gritty texture was part of the point. School dinner halls across Manchester served it through the 1950s and 60s. A Manchester tart day was enough to get children who had planned to go absent to reconsider. The custard had to go on while still warm, or it would skin over and refuse to settle flat. You learned this by watching the older dinner ladies. They showed you the angle of the jug and the motion of the spoon. Knowledge passed by demonstration because the custard required was thicker than any written recipe would specify. The school is gone. The dinner ladies are gone. What they knew that was not on a card left with them and has not come back. Chelsea buns were a genuine 18th century sensation. Made at the Chelsea Bun House near Pimlico, they drew such crowds that King George II was said to walk from the palace on weekend mornings to buy them for himself and his household. The bun itself was a tight spiral of enriched dough wound around cinnamon, allspice, lemon peel and currants, baked until the layers caramelized at the edges and the whole thing pulled apart in sweet, spiced ribbons. They were sold warm, sometimes still steaming. On public holidays, the bun house reportedly sold 50,000 in a single day, a figure that tells you something about both the quality of the bun and the appetite of Georgian London. When the bun house closed in 1839, the recipe spread to bakeries across the country. The version your nan made on Saturday mornings, pulled from the oven in a tin. Spirals pressed together so you had to tear them apart, smelled of warm dough and something slightly burnt at the edges. Nobody has made them that good since. Gypsy tart required just 2 ingredients in the filling, and the trick was entirely in the wrist. You whisked chilled evaporated milk and dark muscovado sugar, nothing else, for 15 full minutes until the mixture turned coffee-colored and held its shape when you lifted the beaters. Underwhisk, and the filling collapsed in the oven. Whisk it right, and it baked into something with a texture unlike anything else in British baking. Light, almost moussey, and intensely sweet in a way that stayed in the back of your throat for an hour. The tart came from the Isle of Sheppey in Kent, finding its way into school dinner rotations across the county through the 1960s, where it was greeted with enthusiasm that made children reconsider their plans to skip school. Muscovado was the key, the dark molasses notes stopping it from being merely sweet. Outside Kent, most people have never heard of it. Inside Kent, it still produces a specific expression on the face of anyone who grew up eating it, a recognition that goes further than memory. Tottenham cake is so specific to North London that most of Britain has never encountered it. Yet in the streets around Tottenham High Road, it was sold for a penny a slice from the 1800s, well into the 20th century. A plain sponge tray bake finished with bright pink icing, the colour originally obtained from mulberries growing in the local Quaker burial ground, where Henry Chalkley, the cake's inventor, was later interred. When Tottenham Hotspur won their first FA Cup in 1901, Chalkley gave free slices to every child in the neighbourhood, the icing staining their fingers pink for hours. Quaker philanthropy made something edible, cheap, sweet, made in quantity and given freely. The desiccated coconut sometimes scattered on top was optional. The pink was not. Local bakeries in Tottenham still make it, and the memory runs deep in certain postcodes. Beyond that tight geography, it vanished almost completely. A hyper-local cake for a community that once knew exactly what it was and why it mattered. Chorley cakes come from Chorley in Lancashire, close enough to Eccles that the two towns have been arguing about currant pastry for centuries. Where the Eccles cake uses flaky pastry and a sweet syruped filling, the Chorley uses plain short crust. The currants are left unadorned, no sugar, no peel, just dried fruit pressed into a flat round of pastry and baked until the edges go biscuit brown. Less showy, and somehow more honest. The Chorley cake was never meant to impress. It was meant to be eaten with tea and to last in a tin until Friday. If you asked someone from Chorley whether they preferred a Chorley or an Eccles, they would look at you as if you had asked whether they preferred breathing to drowning. The distinction mattered deeply, and the preference was not negotiable. The Chorley cake stopped showing up in bakeries outside the area sometime in the 1980s, quietly replaced by everything else. In Chorley itself, some bakeries still make them. The rest of the country let this one go without noticing. The original Bakewell pudding is not the Bakewell tart, and the people of Bakewell, Derbyshire, would prefer you remember this. The pudding, the real one, is a pastry case filled with strawberry jam and a rich egg and almond mixture poured on top, baked until the filling sets to something between a soft tart and a baked custard. The story is that a flustered cook at a Derbyshire inn reversed the instructions sometime around 1860, putting the egg mixture on the jam instead of the pastry base, and produced something so well received it became the local standard. The tart, with its short crust, frangipani and white icing, arrived later and spread wider, until most people now use pudding and tart interchangeably. They are not the same. The original has a wobble and a richness from the egg-heavy filling that no amount of icing can replicate. It still exists in Bakewell, practically nowhere else. Vinegar cake sounds like a dare and tastes like nothing of the sort. A tablespoon or two of malt vinegar reacts with the bicarbonate of soda in place of eggs, producing the lift that rationed eggs could not provide. The result is a dense, dark, fruit-heavy loaf with a faint sourness at the back of the crumb that you could not quite identify and did not quite want to. Cumberland households made it regularly through the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in Methodist and Quaker communities, where practical constraints such as no eggs wasted and nothing extravagant matched the theology. It was not a wartime invention. It was older than that, a piece of quiet northern ingenuity that predated rationing by generations and simply kept going because it worked. You did not mention the vinegar until after guests had finished their second slice. By then, it was too late to object, and usually they did not want to. Dripping cake was what the northern kitchen made when it had rendered fat and a need for something sweet, not lard, but beef dripping, the dark fat from the roasting tin, folded into flour with dried fruit and spice, and baked into a dense loaf that smelled like Sunday dinner had somehow got into the Teatime tin. Yorkshire and Northumberland farmhouse baking, firmly of the tradition that wasted nothing. The fat gave the crumb a slightly savoury undertone that sugar and currants played against. The colour ran dark from the dripping and the dried fruit. There was no recipe anyone wrote down because the recipe changed depending on how much dripping was in the basin and what fruit was left in the jar. She made it in winter, when the joint had been going through the house all week and the basin was full. You came in from the cold, cut a thick slice, ate it standing at the kitchen counter while the kettle boiled. The basin is gone. That particular smell meeting the cold is gone too. Madeira cake was designed to be eaten while drinking something, specifically Madeira wine, the sweet Portuguese import that Georgian dinner parties served through every course, and that cake-hungry Britons eventually decided to consume without the wine. The recipe goes back to at least the 1700s. Eliza Acton published her version in 1845 and helped establish the close-crumbed, lemon-scented loaf as a tea-time standard. The candied citron peel strips laid on top during baking were a quality marker. You could judge a household's standards by whether the peel was there and whether it had been placed with care. By the 1950s, the wine had long since been abandoned, but a slice of Madeira with afternoon tea remained in certain households as a marker of how things should properly be done. By the 1980s, it had faded to something bought in cellophane and eaten without ceremony. The version she made, the one with that characteristic crack running down the top, nobody has made it like that since she stopped. Dundee cake carries a story most Scots bakers will tell you without prompting, that it was created by Janet Keeler's marmalade factory in Dundee in the 1800s, the candied orange peel left over from marmalade production finding its way into a rich fruit cake. Whether the precise origin is true, the connection feels right. The peel and the bittersweet depth it lends, the cake feel like a natural consequence of a city built around preserved citrus. The concentric rings of blanched almonds pressed into the top before baking were always the mark of a properly made one, close at the outer edge, spiraling inward, each almond placed by hand. If the almonds were scattered carelessly, it was not a real Dundee cake. Rich, dense, not overly sweet, flavoured with peel and whiskey and baked low and slow for 2 hours. This was the cake that sat under a tin lid for weeks in the larder and improved with every day of waiting. You could tell how long it had been there by how good it tasted. Bath buns were once heavy, caraway seeded, substantial things, nothing like the light sugar crystal-topped rolls sold in Bath tea shops today. The original Bath bun, described in 18th century recipe books and served in the tea gardens that drew Georgian society to the city, was enriched with butter and eggs and filled with caraway comfits, whole caraway seeds coated in hard white sugar that gave the bun a faint anise crunch and an interior warmth that plain dough couldn't provide. The Sally Lunn arrived, and over the following century, the Bath bun gradually shed its caraway identity, becoming sweeter and softer and more accommodating to tastes that no longer knew what caraway was. The caraway comfit itself, a confectioner's staple in the 17th and 18th centuries, vanished from British baking almost entirely by the 1900s, taking with it the specific flavour that had once made Bath's most famous bun unmistakable. Condensed milk tarts slipped onto the Teatime table through the back door of wartime necessity and stayed for 30 years because it turned out to be genuinely good. A sweetened condensed milk filling, the tinned carnation kind that survived when fresh milk and sugar ran short, poured into a short crust case and baked until it set to a pale, trembling butterscotch-scented layer. Chapel teas in the 40s and the 50s served it on long trestle tables. The Women S Institute made it for the village fete, tin after tin. It required no skill that couldn't be learned in an afternoon, and no ingredient that couldn't be kept in the larder for months. What it required was the tin, and the knowledge that condensed milk baked this way became something different from the stuff you squeezed onto porridge. By the 1970s, when fresh cream and proper custard came back into everyday reach, condensed milk tart quietly receded, left behind by a generation that no longer needed it to stand in for what it couldn't have. Homemade malt loaf was nothing like the serene that replaced it. It was darker, denser, stickier. Black treacle and malt extract were worked through the dough until the whole thing was almost tar-coloured before it went into the oven. It emerged after an hour so dense it left an indentation when you pressed it. A tea-time staple through the post-war years in northern households, it was sliced thin, buttered heavily, and eaten with tea so strong it was almost black itself. The malt extract, a byproduct of the brewing industry available cheaply from the chemists or the co-op, gave it a depth no supermarket equivalent has ever managed to replicate. You always buttered both sides if you could get away with it. There was an argument in most households about whether you could get away with it. She always knew when you'd had an extra slice because the tin was lighter than it should have been. She never said anything. The tin stopped being heavy sometime in the 1980s, and there was no argument to have after that. Wartime carrot cake was not the carrot cake, you know. No cream cheese frosting, no walnuts, nothing moist and rich and modern. It was an austerity bake, grated carrot folded into plain sponge alongside oatmeal, and a scraping of rationed sugar, the carrot doing the sweetening work that sugar could not. The Ministry of Food promoted carrots through their wartime campaigns because carrots grew in Britain and did not need to cross U-boat patrolled Atlantic shipping lanes to arrive. Icing was outlawed as wasteful. There was no frosting. What came out of the oven was pale, dense, and slightly earthy, and families ate it because the women who made it had stretched everything they had to make sure it was there. When rationing ended in 1954 and sugar came back in quantity, the carrot cake became something richer. But the hands that had learned to bake without sugar never quite forgot what scarcity had required of them, and the knowledge of how to make something out of almost nothing went quiet with those hands. Lemon curd tarts began in the pantry, in the row of jam jars filled in autumn, the lemon curd sitting among the preserves because it kept for weeks in a cool larder and was made whenever lemons were cheap and eggs were in supply. The curd itself was cooked slowly in a bowl over simmering water. Butter and sugar and egg yolks and lemon juice were stirred together until they thickened and turned pale gold. Too fast, and the eggs scrambled. Too slow, and the butter separated. She could do it without watching. You watched her to learn. The curd went into blind-baked short-crust shells, not much bigger than your palm, and the shells came out of the oven trembling, the filling still moving when you lifted the tray. Made for Sunday tea when company was coming. She made them the morning before and kept them cool in the larder. Nobody makes them for company anymore. Nobody keeps a larder anymore either. And the patience required to stir curd at the right temperature for 20 minutes without rushing it is not something that transfers by watching on a screen. Jam tarts at home were nothing like the shop variety. Not the pale, uniformly round tins of 6 with gel-bright fillings, but rough-edged circles cut with a glass or a tin lid. Each one slightly different because the pastry re-rolled unevenly and the jam set at different speeds. Homemade in every imperfection. The tartlets were the first thing she let you make yourself. Standing on a stool, pressing pastry rounds into the bun tin with your thumbs, spooning jam with a teaspoon so it would not overflow. First jobs, taken very seriously. It always overflowed. The overflowed bits caramelized on the tin and were scraped off while still warm and eaten standing at the cooker because they were too good to waste. The strawberry ones were always eaten first. The blackcurrant ones were always left. There was always an argument about who had to have the blackcurrant. Caramelized crumbs remembered more than the tarts themselves. The argument, the caramelized bits, the stool at the table, all of it went when the kitchen changed. The shop tins came instead, neat and uniform. They have never overflowed once. Ginger Parkin biscuits were the harder, flatter sibling of Parkin cake, baked in rounds and snapped rather than sliced, made to survive in a tin for the whole of bonfire night week. The treacle and ginger were proportioned for keeping. A biscuit that went soft too soon was one that had been made wrong. Yorkshire households baked them in batches in late October, the kitchen filling with the dark, warm smell of black treacle heating in the pan, a smell so specific to early November that catching it anywhere else still stops people mid-step. You broke them into the fire sometimes as an offering, or more often just stood in the cold eating them, fingers sticky with treacle, the ginger hitting the back of your throat. The recipe lived in the same handwritten notebook as the Parkin cake. The ink on that page faded to brown from years of flour-dusted handling. The notebook is gone. The biscuits went with it. Nelson squares were Depression and wartime kitchen economy made edible, sponge scraps soaked in thinned jam, pressed together, weighted overnight, cut into squares and dusted with icing sugar or desiccated coconut. The whole thing firmed into something almost presentable by morning. The name varied by region and household. Some people called them Chester squares, others called them nothing at all, and only made them when there was a bowl of broken sponge pieces left after trimming a cake. Nothing was wasted. That was the rule, and it turned offcuts into a treat. Church hall suppers in the 1940s set them out on plates alongside the sandwiches, and children who had never seen a proper layer cake ate them without knowing they were eating the leftover edges of something else. They tasted better than they had any right to, which is the oldest story in British baking. They stopped being made the moment there was enough money not to need to make them. Caraway seed biscuits were the biscuit the Victorian and Edwardian Teatime table took for granted. Plain, short, dry, flavoured with the same caraway that ran through seed cake and the old Bath bun. They were placed beside the teacup without ceremony, as if they had always been there and always would be. The taste of caraway was once as familiar in British kitchens as ginger or cinnamon, used freely in baking from at least the 17th century. Then it stopped. Not all at once, and not with any single moment you can point to. Somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, the British palate moved away from caraway, as though it had decided by collective and unspoken agreement that this flavour belonged somewhere else now, to Scandinavia, to Germany, to the past. The seed cake went, the Bath bun shed its comfits, the biscuits left the plate, and the last person who reached for the caraway tin without thinking did it one day, and then never reached for it again. The kitchens went silent, and they took their recipes with them. Tell us what you remember.